It was one of those nights where nothing special was going on. I was just sitting on my front porch with Max, my dog, relaxing after a long day. The sun had set, leaving that kind of hazy twilight where everything's quiet, and all you hear are crickets and the occasional rustling in the trees. You know, peaceful. I was scrolling through my phone, not really paying attention to anything, just passing the time. Then I heard it. At first, I thought it was nothing, just some random sound, maybe the wind, or an animal moving through the woods behind my house. It's a common thing when you live out in the country. But this noise was different. It wasn't the usual rustle of leaves or the chirping of insects. It was this deep, low sound, like a growl or a rumble, coming from the woods. I glanced over at Max, half expecting him to be as chill as I was. But he wasn't. He was tense, his ears perked up, staring into the darkness like he knew something I didn't. Max is usually pretty laid back. I mean, the guy sleeps through thunderstorms. But tonight, something had him on edge. "Come on, Max, it's probably just a raccoon or something," I muttered, trying to reassure myself more than him. But Max wasn't buying it. His growling started low, barely a rumble at first, but then it grew louder. He was staring straight into the trees behind the house, his body stiff like he was ready to bolt. That's when the noise got louder. It wasn't just a growl anymore. It was like something big was moving through the trees. You could hear the branches snapping, leaves crunching. It didn't sound right. Not like any animal I'd heard before. I stood up, trying to get a better look. My phone's flashlight barely lit up the edge of the woods, but whatever it was, it sounded closer than I could see. My heart started racing a bit, but I still thought maybe I was just imagining things. My mind was trying to convince me it was probably a deer, or maybe a bear passing through. Still, there was something off. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone out here. I should have gone inside right then, locked the doors, and called it a night. But I didn't. Instead, I grabbed the real flashlight from inside and decided to check it out. Yeah, I know, dumb move. But curiosity does that to you. You always think, I'll just take a quick look. What could go wrong, right? Max wasn't having it, though. He stayed planted where he was growling low in his throat. I had to tug on his leash to get him to follow me. And even then, he moved reluctantly, glancing over his shoulder like he knew something bad was coming. I walked towards the trees, heart pounding a little harder with every step. The closer we got, the quieter everything seemed. The crickets stopped. The wind didn't even rustle the leaves anymore. It was like the whole world was holding its breath. I stopped at the tree line, scanning the area with the flashlight. But there was nothing, just shadows and branches swaying in the dark. For a moment, I almost laughed at myself for being so jumpy. But then, just as I was about to turn back, I saw them. Footprints. Huge ones, bigger than any animal tracks I'd ever seen around here. They were pressed deep into the ground, almost like something heavy had been walking there. The shape was weird too, not like a bear's paw or a deer's hoof. These had long, deep claw marks, spread wide apart like whatever made them wasn't in any rush. My stomach dropped. I don't know why, but looking at those prints, I suddenly felt very small, like something was watching me. Something big. I glanced at Max, expecting him to start growling again. But he was quiet now, just staring into the trees, his eyes wide. I could feel my pulse in my ears. I took a step back, shining the light further into the woods. But all I saw was more darkness. Whatever had been there, it wasn't anymore. Or at least I couldn't see it. Still, that noise from earlier? It hadn't just been in my head. Something had been out here, something big enough to leave those prints. I should have felt relieved that it was gone. But instead, I felt more nervous than ever, like it could come back any second. I pulled on Max's leash, ready to head back to the house. But as I turned around, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, hiding in the shadows, watching us. As I stood there at the edge of the trees, staring down at those strange, oversized footprints, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. It wasn't just the size that got me, it was how fresh they looked. The ground was still slightly damp from the rain the night before, and the prints were deep, too deep for anything light. Whatever had made them was big, real big, and heavy enough to crush the earth beneath its feet. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was close by. I knelt down, taking a closer look at the footprints. They were unlike anything I'd ever seen before. Sure, I've seen deer prints, bear tracks, even coyote prints around these parts, but this This wasn't like any of them. These tracks were wider, the toes spread out in an unnatural way, and those claws, long, sharp, and embedded deep into the ground. They almost looked human, but twisted, wrong somehow. Each step was spaced far apart, like whatever made them had a massive stride. My mind was racing. I tried to come up with a logical explanation. Maybe it was just a bear, I told myself, even though I knew it didn't look like any bear print I'd ever seen. Bears are common enough out here, but their paws are more rounded, and they don't leave claw marks like this unless they're climbing something. These prints, though, they were long, stretched out, and clearly belonged to something walking on all fours. At least that's what I hoped. I stood up slowly, shining the flashlight around the woods, but there was nothing, just the quiet rustling of leaves as the wind picked up. Max was still by my side, but he wasn't growling anymore. He was just staring ahead, like he was waiting for something to appear, or maybe he could sense what I couldn't. His ears were perked up, his body tense, but he wasn't making a sound, and that only made me more uneasy. "Max, come on, let's go," I whispered, my voice barely louder than the breeze. I tugged at his leash, but he wouldn't move. His paws were planted firmly in the dirt, his eyes fixed on something in the distance. I followed his gaze, but all I saw were more trees, thick and dark, stretching endlessly into the night. The flashlight barely pierced the shadows, and every step I took felt heavier than the last. My heart was pounding in my chest, each beat louder than the silence that surrounded us. Then, something snapped in the distance. A branch, maybe? My breath caught in my throat as I whipped the flashlight in that direction. The beam flickered, the weak light struggling to cut through the dark. For a moment, I thought I saw something move, a shadow, or maybe just the wind playing tricks on me. But whatever it was fast, too fast for me to get a good look. Max let out a low whine, and that's when I knew whatever was out there wasn't gone. It was still watching, still waiting. "Let's go," I said again, more firmly this time, pulling harder on Max's leash. This time he followed, but his steps were hesitant, his body tense like he was ready to bolt at any second. We started walking back toward the house, my flashlight bobbing with each step, casting shaky beams of light onto the ground. But as we moved away from the trees, something caught my eye, more footprints. They were scattered, some leading deeper into the woods, others closer to the house. My pulse quickened. It wasn't just one set of tracks. There were several. I crouched down again, shining the light on them. They all had the same shape, large, clawed, and human. But they weren't all the same size. Some were smaller, but not by much, and they followed no clear pattern. It was like multiple creatures had passed through here, moving in different directions, crisscrossing over each other's tracks. "Okay, this is getting weird," I muttered to myself, my voice shaky. My first thought was to head back inside, lock the doors, and pretend I hadn't seen anything. But there was this gnawing feeling in my gut, this curiosity that wouldn't let me leave without understanding what was going on. But something wasn't right. That much I knew for sure. I straightened up, shining the flashlight one last time toward the woods. The wind had picked up, making the trees sway and groan, but the air still felt thick, heavy with something I couldn't explain. Max was tugging on the leash now, clearly ready to go home, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had made those tracks was still out there, watching us, maybe even following us. With one last look over my shoulder, I finally turned away from the woods. My pace quickened, and Max stayed close by, his eyes darting nervously around as we made our way back to the house. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, made my heart race faster. We reached the porch, and I hesitated for a second, staring back at the trees, half expecting to see something emerge from the darkness. But there was nothing, just the empty stretch of woods, silent and still. I swallowed hard, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling crawling up my spine. I unlocked the door and stepped inside, Max following close behind. As soon as we were inside, I bolted the door, double-checking the lock. I don't know why I felt the need to lock it so fast. After all, animals can't open doors, right? I sank down onto the couch, trying to calm my racing heart. But I couldn't shake the image of those footprints out of my head. What kind of animal leaves prints like that? And why were there so many scattered all around like they were circling the area? Max curled up next to me, but his ears were still twitching, like he was listening for something just outside the door. I couldn't relax. My mind kept going back to those prints, the strange shape of them, the way they seemed to stop and start like something or somethings were stalking us. I sat there for what felt like hours, just listening to the silence outside, half expecting to hear that growl again, or worse, to hear something scratching at the door. But the house stayed quiet. That night was the longest I've ever experienced. Even though I was back inside, safe behind the locked door, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, lurking in the shadows of the woods, watching. Max must have felt it too, because he didn't settle down. Normally, after a long walk, he'd collapse on the floor and fall asleep in minutes. But tonight, he was restless, pacing from the front door to the window, his ears twitching at every sound. It was driving me crazy. I grabbed a beer from the fridge, hoping it would calm my nerves. Sitting on the couch, I stared out the window into the pitch-black darkness beyond the porch. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of everything I'd seen. The prints, the strange sounds in the woods, the way Max had acted. It all seemed like some kind of bad dream. But it wasn't. I knew what I saw, and I knew it wasn't normal. But what was it? As I sat there, my phone buzzed, breaking the silence. It was a text from Jake, my buddy who lived about 10 minutes down the road. He'd grown up around here and knew these woods like the back of his hand. If anyone could make sense of this, it'd be him. I texted him about the tracks, the weird noise, and how Max had been acting. After a few minutes, Jake texted back, "Man, sounds like a bear to me. They're moving around a lot this time of year, especially at night." I sighed. A bear. That would make sense, right? But something didn't sit right with that explanation. The size of those prints, the strange shape of them. It wasn't like any bear I'd seen before. But still, I was ready to believe anything that made this whole situation feel less creepy. I typed back, "Yeah, maybe. Just didn't look like bear tracks, man. Something was off." Jake responded with, "Stay inside, don't go messing with it. Could just be passing through." I locked my phone and set it down, trying to shake the feeling that something was wrong. Jake's words made sense. There were bears in the area, and sometimes they wandered close to homes. But I couldn't forget the way those prints looked, or the strange growl I'd heard. It was deeper, more guttural than any bear I'd come across. And then there was Max. He wasn't acting like this was just some bear passing by. Suddenly, Max's growl cut through the silence, low and menacing. I shot up from the couch, my heart pounding again. He was standing at the window, staring outside. His body was rigid, for standing on end, the kind of stance that told me he was ready for a fight. I walked over slowly, my legs feeling like lead as I approached the window. I stood behind him, peering out into the night. At first, I saw nothing, just the dark outline of the trees, the faint glow of the moon casting long shadows on the ground. But then I saw it. Something moved, just for a second, between the trees at the edge of the yard. I blinked, my heart stopping for a moment. There it was again, just a flicker of movement, a shadow shifting in the darkness. It was fast, too fast for me to get a clear look. But I knew something was out there, something watching us. "Max," I whispered, "come here, boy." But he didn't budge. He kept growling, his eyes locked on the trees, like he was daring whatever it was to come closer. I grabbed my phone again, my hands shaking as I texted Jake. "Man, something's out there. I don't think it's a bear." The reply came almost instantly. "What do you mean? What did you see?" I couldn't even describe it, so I just typed back. "Something big moving fast. I don't know what it is." Jake didn't respond right away, and that only made me more nervous. I was standing there, holding my breath, waiting for some kind of explanation, some reassurance that this wasn't as bad as it seemed. But none came. The minutes dragged on, and Max finally backed away from the window, but he didn't stop growling. I tried to convince myself that maybe it was a bear, maybe it was just curious and wandered close to the house. But that didn't explain why it was so fast or why I couldn't get a clear look at it. I should have felt relieved that I didn't see it again, but the longer I stood there, the more that sense of being watched crept over me, chilling me to the bone. I glanced at the clock. It It was just past midnight, but I knew sleep wasn't going to happen anytime soon. I checked the locks on the doors twice, then paced the living room, my eyes flicking to the window every few seconds, expecting to see something moving out there again. Eventually, I sat back down on the couch, trying to calm myself. I told myself that maybe I was just imagining things, that my mind was playing tricks on me after seeing those strange footprints. Maybe it was just the darkness messing with my head. But deep down, I knew better. Max had settled next to me, his growl fading into occasional low rumbles, but he kept his eyes on the door. It was like he was waiting for something, and that's what scared me the most. Dogs know when something's off, when something's out of place. And Max? He was on high alert. I trusted his instincts more than my own. Then, there it was again, a noise outside, soft but distinct, like something brushing against the side of the house. My heart skipped a beat. I grabbed the flashlight from the coffee table and stood up, moving slowly toward the window, my breath catching in my throat. I shined the light out into the yard, my hand shaking. Nothing. I swept the beam back and forth, searching the shadows for any sign of movement, but there was nothing there. Just the quiet hum of the night. I wanted to believe that it was all in my head, that maybe I was just spooked from earlier, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching, waiting. I stayed like that for what felt like hours, staring out the window, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. The house remained silent, the night calm. Eventually, exhaustion started to creep in, and I sat back down, though I kept the flashlight in my hand, just in case. Max finally lay down beside me, still tense but no longer growling. I tried to convince myself that maybe it was over, that whatever was out there had moved on. But as I closed my eyes, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. Morning didn't bring the relief I was hoping for. I barely slept, and when I did, my dreams were filled with shadows and strange noises, leaving me more exhausted than when I'd first sat down. Max stayed by the door all night, never really relaxing, just keeping watch. As the early light crept through the windows, I sat up and rubbed my face, trying to shake the lingering dread from the night before. The first thing I did was head to the kitchen, make a strong cup of coffee, and try to convince myself that whatever had been out there was long gone. But deep down, I didn't believe that. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still nearby, like it was just waiting for the right moment to come back. Max was still acting strange, pacing in front of the door and staring out the window as if he expected something to be standing on the porch. I grabbed the flashlight from where I'd left it on the coffee table and decided to check outside. The daylight made me feel a bit more secure, but the unease from last night lingered. As I stepped out onto the porch, Max followed close behind, his eyes constantly scanning the treeline. The fresh morning air was cool, the kind of crisp air that usually feels refreshing. But today, it only felt heavy, like it was holding secrets I wasn't ready to face. I walked down the steps and into the yard, aiming the flashlight toward the ground. My eyes immediately went to the spot where I had seen the footprints the night before, the ones that had sent chills down my spine. They were still there, clear as day, almost mocking me in the bright morning light. Somehow, seeing them in daylight didn't make them any less unsettling. If anything, they felt more real, more present. I followed the prints again, retracing the same path I had walked the night before. Only now, they seemed more erratic. They weren't just in a straight line like I had thought. They circled around, doubled back, crisscrossed. It was as if whatever had made them had been pacing, watching the house from different angles. The realization that it had been closer to the house than I'd first noticed made my skin crawl. How long had it been out there just watching? I crouched down by the largest set of prints, running my hand over the dirt. They were deep, much deeper than a bear's would have been. The claws were long, and the space between each step was unnervingly wide. I looked up toward the woods, where the tracks seemed to vanish into the shadows between the trees, swallowed by the thick brush. Something in me wanted to follow them, to see where they led. Maybe it was some leftover bravado from the safety of daylight, or maybe I was just tired of feeling scared. But I knew going into those woods wasn't a good idea, not alone. Max stayed at the edge of the yard, refusing to follow me toward the trees. He just stared, his ears pinned back, letting out low whines every few seconds. It was like he knew something I didn't. I couldn't ignore that. "All right, boy," I said, walking back toward him. "I guess we're not doing this today." As I headed back to the house, my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was Jake again. I hadn't talked to him since my frantic text last night, but seeing his name pop up gave me a strange sense of comfort. I unlocked the phone and saw his message. "Hey man, everything okay? You still seeing weird stuff?" I sighed, typing back. "Yeah, the prints are still here. It's not a bear, Jake. I don't know what it is, but it's big and it's watching the house. You ever heard of anything like this around here?" There was a pause before Jake's reply came through. "No, not really. I mean, there are stories, but they're old, just local legends. Nothing anyone takes seriously. Want me to come by later? We can check it out together." I hesitated for a moment, staring at the message. The idea of someone else being here made me feel less crazy, less alone. But at the same time, I wasn't sure I wanted to put anyone else in danger, even if we didn't know what exactly we were dealing with. "Yeah," I finally replied. "Come by later. I'm not going into those woods alone." The rest of the day was spent in a weird haze of unease. I tried to distract myself with work, chores, anything to keep my mind from wandering back to the prints and the strange noises from the night before. But no matter what I did, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching, waiting. Max didn't help, either. He barely left my side, always alert, always on edge. Jake arrived just after sunset. I had left the porch light on, and when I saw his truck pull up, I felt a wave of relief. He stepped out, looking relaxed, but I could see the curiosity in his eyes. He wasn't one to spook easily, but even he seemed a little cautious as he walked up the steps. "All right, let's see what's got you all worked up," Jake said with a grin, though there was a hint of seriousness in his tone. I took him around the yard, showing him the footprints. His face grew more serious as he crouched down to inspect them. He didn't say anything for a while, just ran his fingers over the impressions in the dirt, his brow furrowed. "These aren't bear tracks," he finally said, echoing what I'd already known. "But I've never seen anything like this either." It's weird. That wasn't the answer I was hoping for, but at least I wasn't crazy. "You think it's some kind of animal?" I asked. Jake shrugged, standing up and dusting off his hands. "I don't know. Could be. But it's not like anything I've seen around here. Whatever it is, it's big, and it's coming close to the house." We stood there in silence for a moment, staring out at the woods. The sun had set by now, and the darkness was creeping back in, swallowing the yard, the trees, everything. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there again, just beyond where the light touched. "Should we check the woods?" Jake asked. I swallowed hard, glancing at the trees. The thought of going back into the darkness where those tracks led made my stomach turn, but I knew we couldn't just ignore it forever. "Yeah," I said, my voice quieter than I intended. "But we should be careful." Jake nodded, pulling a flashlight from his truck. "Let's not go too far, just enough to see if anything's close by." With Max close behind us, the two of us stepped toward the woods, the flashlight beams cutting through the thickening night. As we moved closer, the air seemed to grow colder, heavier. My heart was racing, every sound amplified by the silence around us. We reached the edge of the woods, the same spot where the tracks disappeared. Jake shined his light on the ground, but the tracks were harder to make out here, the underbrush thick and uneven. The beam flickered over the trees, catching shadows that seemed to shift as we moved. And then we heard it, that same low growl from the night before, only this time, it was closer. The growl froze us in place. It wasn't a distant sound like before. It was close, so close that I could feel the rumble of it in my chest. My hand tightened around the flashlight, my knuckles going white. For a moment, neither Jake nor I moved, our breath shallow, ears straining to figure out where exactly the sound was coming from. Jake shot me a quick glance, his usual confidence slipping away. His flashlight beam darted around the trees, but the light only seemed to highlight how dark everything else was. I felt Max pressing against my leg, his body rigid, his growl matching whatever was lurking out there. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, though I knew the answer. Jake nodded, his eyes wide, his voice low. "Yeah, it's too close, man. There was a rustling sound in the brush to our left, then another low, throaty growl. It felt like the woods themselves were alive, like something was circling us, hiding in the dark. My heart pounded against my ribs, my mouth dry. Max was pulling at his leash now, like he wanted to bolt, to drag me away from whatever was out there. I was ready to let him. "We need to get out of here," I said, my voice barely steady. Jake nodded again, backing up slowly, his flashlight shaking in his hand. "Yeah, let's go. Now." But just as we started to move, there was a loud crash from the trees behind us. A branch snapping, leaves rustling, and then another growl, even closer. It felt like the creature, whatever it was right on top of us. My breath caught in my throat as I whipped the flashlight around, the beam darting through the trees. For a split second, I thought I saw something huge, hunched, moving between the shadows, but it was gone before I could make sense of it. "Run!" Jake yelled, his voice breaking the tension as he turned and bolted, flashlight bouncing wildly in his hand. I didn't need to be told twice. My feet moved before my brain even registered it, and Max and I were running, following Jake as fast as we could. My heart pounded in my ears, adrenaline surging through my veins as we crashed through the underbrush, branches slapping at my face, the flashlight flickering with every step. I could hear the thing behind us, whatever it was, moving through the trees, crashing through branches and brush, heavy footsteps pounding the ground. It wasn't just chasing us. It was fast, faster than any animal I'd ever seen. I didn't dare look back. Every instinct I had screamed at me to keep going, to get as far away from that sound as possible. Jake was a few steps ahead of me, his flashlight swinging wildly as he ran, and Max was practically dragging me forward, his leash taut as he pulled me through the trees. I could feel the cold sweat on my forehead, the burn in my legs as we sprinted for the edge of the woods. The house felt miles away, even though I knew we weren't far. Behind us, the growling grew louder, closer. I could hear it gaining on us, hear the way the ground seemed to shake with each step it took. My heart raced faster, and I pushed myself harder, feet slamming into the dirt, lungs burning with every breath. My mind raced, trying to figure out how something that big could move so fast. Then out of nowhere, I tripped, my foot caught on a root, and I went down hard, the flashlight flying out of my hand and bouncing into the darkness. I hit the ground with a thud, the wind knocked out of me, dirt scraping my hands and knees. Max was barking frantically, pulling at the leash, trying to get me back up, but my body felt like lead. "Get up!" Jake's voice rang out, desperate but distant. I struggled to get to my feet, every muscle in my body screaming in protest. I could hear the thing behind us, the heavy footsteps growing louder, closer. My heart felt like it was going to explode. I grabbed Max's leash, pushing myself up as quickly as I could, and took off running again, my legs wobbling beneath me. Just as I was starting to regain my balance, I heard a different sound. A snarl, loud, vicious, and then the noise of something crashing into the trees right behind me. I risked a glance over my shoulder, and for a split second, I saw it. It was huge, towering over the bushes, covered in thick, matted fur. Its eyes were glowing, reflecting the faint light from the fallen flashlight, and it was coming straight for me. I turned back around and ran faster, fueled by pure terror. Jake was ahead of me, screaming for me to hurry up, but my feet felt like they were moving in slow motion. The growling behind me was so close, I could almost feel its hot breath on my neck. Then all of a sudden, Max stopped dead in his tracks. He spun around, planting his feet in the dirt, and started barking wildly, a sound I'd never heard from him before. It was almost like he was challenging whatever was chasing us. I yanked at his leash, but he wouldn't budge. "Max, no!" I shouted, my voice breaking, panic seizing my chest. But he stood his ground, his fur bristling, barking like his life depended on it. The creature, whatever it was, stopped. For just a moment, it hesitated. I could hear it breathing, heavy and labored, somewhere in the dark behind us. And then, without warning, it turned and vanished into the trees, the sounds of its footsteps fading into the distance. I stood there, gasping for breath, unable to comprehend what had just happened. Max was still barking, his body tense, ready for a fight, but whatever had been chasing us was gone. Just like that. 1 second it was on top of us, and the next it was gone like it had never been there at all. Jake came running back, his flashlight flickering as he approached, his face pale. What the hell was that? He panted, eyes wide, scanning the woods around us. I don't know. I managed to choke out, still trying to catch my breath. It had just stopped. We stood there for what felt like forever, the night suddenly silent around us. The only sound, the distant rustling of leaves in the breeze. Max had finally stopped barking, though he stayed close to my side, his eyes still locked on the trees, as if expecting the creature to come back. "Let's get out of here," Jake said, his voice shaky. He didn't need to tell me twice. We walked, almost ran, back to the house, neither of us saying a word. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened, but nothing added up. That thing, whatever it was, should have caught us. It was too fast, too big, but it had stopped. Why? When we finally reached the porch, I collapsed onto the steps, my hands trembling, my entire body still buzzing with adrenaline. Jake leaned against the railing, staring out into the woods, his face unreadable. "I've never seen anything like that," he muttered, breaking the silence. "What the hell is out there?" I shook my head, still in disbelief. "I don't know, man, but it's not just an animal. It's something else." Jake didn't say anything, but the look in his eyes told me he knew I was right. Whatever had chased us through those woods, it wasn't just an animal. It was something more, something dangerous. And the worst part, I had a feeling it wasn't finished with us yet. Sitting on the porch steps, the adrenaline was still coursing through me, making my hands shake as I tried to calm down. Max sat beside me, panting but still on high alert, his eyes darting toward the woods. Jake stood next to the porch railing, gripping it tightly, his eyes locked on the trees as though he expected that thing to burst out of the shadows at any moment. Neither of us spoke for a while. The woods were silent now, eerily silent, as if nothing had ever happened. I ran a hand through my hair, trying to shake the memory of those glowing eyes, the way the creature had barreled through the trees like it owned the place. It was bigger than anything I'd ever seen. Its presence felt more than seen, like it carried the weight of the night with it. And the speed, it shouldn't have been possible for something so large to move that fast. Yet, here we were still breathing, still intact. Jake finally broke the silence. "Man, what the hell was that?" His voice was low, almost shaky, like he didn't want to admit he was scared but couldn't help it. I shook my head, staring out into the darkness. "I don't know, but it's not something from around here. No animal I've ever seen moves like that. No animal stops like that either. It had us, Jake. It could have gotten us, but it just stopped." Jake leaned back against the railing, rubbing his forehead. "Yeah, that's what's messing with me. Why'd it stop? It was right there, and then it just let us go. Like it wasn't even interested anymore." The thought gnawed at me. Why had it stopped? It was so close that I could feel the ground tremble beneath its steps, hear its heavy breathing, the growl vibrating in my bones. And then, like a switch had been flipped, it just turned away and disappeared into the night. There was no sense to it, and that's what scared me the most. "Maybe it wasn't after us," I said slowly, trying to make sense of it. "Maybe it was just trying to scare us off." Jake glanced at me like I'd lost my mind. "Scare us off? For what? This is our land, our woods. What could it possibly want from us?" I didn't have an answer. The woods, the trees, the land, it had always felt like home. I grew up exploring those woods, knowing every trail, every hidden corner. But tonight, it didn't feel like ours anymore. It felt like something had claimed it, something that had been there all along, waiting. Max whined softly, pressing against my leg. I reached down to stroke his fur, trying to calm him, but the unease remained thick in the air. Even though the growls and footsteps were gone, the woods felt alive with an unseen presence. I could feel it, hovering just beyond the reach of the porch light. Jake sighed, pushing off the railing. "We can't just sit out here all night waiting for it to come back. Let's head inside, regroup, and figure out what the hell we're dealing with." I nodded, though the thought of going back inside the house didn't bring me much comfort. The walls felt thin now, like they couldn't protect us from whatever was out there. Still, Sitting out here wasn't helping either. We stepped inside, locking the door behind us, but the unease followed us in. Jake slumped into a chair at the kitchen table, running his hands through his hair. "You ever heard stories about anything like this around here?" he asked, his voice sounding tired. I thought back to what Jake had said earlier, about old legends. Growing up, there had always been stories, but they were just that, stories. Things people told around a campfire to scare the kids. Legends about creatures that roamed the woods at night, guarding the land, protecting something ancient. But I'd never believed in any of it. I didn't believe in ghosts or monsters. At least, I hadn't until tonight. There were stories, I admitted, feeling a knot tighten in my stomach. Old ones, passed down through the generations. My grandfather used to tell me about a creature that lived in the woods, something that only came out at night. He said it wasn't evil, just territorial. It protected the land. Jake raised an eyebrow. Territorial? So you think this thing's out here protecting something? I don't know, I said, shaking my head. I never believed those stories. I always thought they were just myths. But now it's standing in your backyard. Jake finished, a grim smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of everything settling in. Max curled up at my feet, his head resting on his paws, but his eyes never left the door. It felt like the quiet before the storm, like the night wasn't done with us yet. "What do we do?" Jake finally asked, his voice quieter now, more serious. "I don't know," I admitted, staring at the door, half expecting to see those glowing eyes peering in through the window. "I guess we just stay alert. Maybe it'll leave us alone if we don't go back into the woods." Jake didn't seem convinced. "And if it doesn't?" I didn't have an answer for that. "What could we do? Call the police? Tell them there's a giant creature in the woods that chased us but then decided not to finish the job? They'd think we were crazy." Hell, I felt crazy just saying it out loud. "Let's just get through the night," I said. "We'll figure it out in the morning." Jake nodded, though the unease in his eyes hadn't left. Neither had mine. We both knew that whatever was out there wasn't just going to disappear because the sun came up. This wasn't a problem that daylight could solve. The hours dragged on, the house eerily quiet. Every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the wind outside made us both jump. The night stretched long, and sleep was impossible. My mind kept replaying the chase, the way the creature had stopped so suddenly. It was like it had been playing with us, testing us, seeing how we would react. And that thought kept me from resting. Around 3 a.m., Max perked up again, his ears twitching, his eyes fixed on the door. I held my breath, listening, waiting. Jake froze, his eyes locking onto mine. The house was silent, too silent. Then we heard it, that growl.